Hello, welcome back to another Speedbuild video. Today we'll be taking a look at how I made Togepi in Blender. So let's get into it. So here I attempt to start making the shape for Togepi's shell. So this was maybe my third attempt at creating the shell, but later on I ended up changing it just because I wasn't really happy with how it turned out. But I decided to leave this in so I could show you the overall process of how it became what it is. So here I was trying to create the illusion that the shell was a little bit thick, but in the end it made it look a lot worse. So instead of making you sit here and watch the whole thing, we'll just skip right ahead. So now we move on to making the main body. Again, this was my third attempt at making the body, but I am not going to bore you by making you watch the other two times I did it. And the first couple of times that I actually made this, I didn't realize that Togepi had 5 of those petal things on top of its head. So I was trying to figure out different ways on how I could extrude it. It took a few attempts before I was happy with the outcome. So once I extruded them out, I then began the slow and painful process of shaping the petals on top of its head. So because I've only been working in Blender for about 8 weeks by this point, I'm hoping to become more efficient and quicker when creating characters in Blender. And speaking of, if you have any tips and tricks on how to be more efficient, please feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Now, while I was in the process of making Togepi, I kinda wanted to know what sort of animal it resembled in real life. So by doing that, I looked into its evolutions, and it turns out that it resembles a bird. So what I ended up doing was looking up images of how a baby chick looks, and noticed some chicks were very fluffy, and some chicks had little fur or patchy fur all over the place. So what I wanted to try and do is to resemble a baby chick that had very little hair and patchy all over the place. But because I wasn't very familiar with the hair dynamics in Blender, I ended up going with the latter. I had attempted to make it patchy, but it just turned out really ugly and unrealistic. Okay, so now that I've done the main body, it kinda looks a little bit like Jigglypuff. So now I'm masking out the eyes, thinking that this would be a better, more efficient way of creating the eye sockets for Togepi. Goodness me, was I wrong. And since it's been a few weeks since I've finished creating Togepi and I've gone on to create other Pokemon, I found creating a mask was not the most efficient way to do it. So I added spheres into the scene so I can mold the eye socket around it. Again, this took way too long than it should have, but I guess it's what it's like when you first start using a new software. So now here we are creating the mouth for Togepi. I don't know if I have changed the way I create the mouth in other Pokemon, but again, this was quite inefficient. And again, I ended up spending way too long on just trying to smooth out the edges of the mouth, but I think we got there eventually. And here I create obviously the arms for Togepi. I decided to leave them as they were, just because knowing in the back of my mind that all the detail that I wanted to put into the arms was just going to be covered by fur anyway. Okay, so here we are with texture painting. So it's my first actual attempt at texture painting and UV unwrapping without using some sort of tutorial to help me through. So I've had to cut this down quite a bit because I spent roughly about 45 minutes just working on this shape alone before I came to realize that I needed to find a way to utilize that time a lot better. So what I ended up doing was I ended up drawing the basic outlines of the shapes and then went into a little bit of finer detail a little bit later. I think overall it took me a few hours to get the shapes completed. I definitely found it a lot difficult trying to get smoother edges using a mouse. I would probably need to invest in one of those pens at some point in the near future if I want to carry on with this sort of stuff. Now I am adding a texture image of an eggshell. Again, this is the first time that I attempted to put a texture image on an object without using a tutorial. As you can see, I was having trouble trying to figure that out. I eventually did figure it out, and I was quite happy with that. So I was getting pretty happy with how the shell looked. I then decided to put a height displacement on there as well, just to add that little bit of realism to it. But when looking back at the final edit, maybe I could have just bumped it up a teeny weeny bit more, but oh well. But this is eventually what it looked like. As you can see, I've already put fur on it, but I end up redoing that whole thing, which is why you haven't seen it. So now I'm just putting in some basic eye color just to get an idea. So I actually didn't know what the eye color of Togepi was until a friend of mine showed me. So here, this is where I attempt to remake the eggshell after I followed a tutorial. Actually, this is me following a tutorial as we speak. The video itself is actually a tutorial on how to simulate an eggshell breaking open, but obviously it still showed you how to make the shell anyway. So I put a link in the description below for those who are interested in it. But honestly, I didn't think that I would be that lucky to come across a tutorial on how to make an eggshell. So basically what I've done is created the basic egg shape, and then I created a plane and added some randomizer to it, and using that I was able to create that cracked eggshell effect that I was actually trying to look for to begin with. Even though the shapes on the shell wasn't quite exactly what it looked like on Togepi, I think for me it kind of added a little bit more realism to it, just to have that inconsistency of the cracks anyway. And then at this point, it's when I knew I screwed up. So with the texture painting, I'm not sure what I did wrong. So basically I ended up redrawing the whole thing. Here is where I attempt to make an eye. I've watched so many tutorials, but for some reason my eyes always turned out strange. So what I ended up doing is I just ended up buying an eyeball just for the time being, just until I can actually figure out how to consistently make really good eyes. I also put a link below where I bought the eyeball. So now we're on to the really fun part, the fur. So I ended up watching a tutorial on how to create fur, but now that it's been a few weeks and I'm a little bit more familiar with creating fur, I realized we didn't need to create 3 layers of fur. I mean, it still turned out good, but it may not always be necessary to add several layers of fur, especially with a Pokemon that small. So maybe when it comes to doing Togekiss and Togetic, maybe that's when the multiple layers of fur could potentially come in. So now we're on to creating the feet for Togepi. I ended up recreating the foot because I somehow accidentally deleted it. I think when I was trying to clean out the materials in my folders, I think I accidentally somehow managed to delete the feet as well. But this time I decided to add a little bit more details by trying to create like a hoof type shape in the middle, but also still trying to keep it simple because again it's just going to be covered in fur. So this is where I start working on the eyes for Togepi from the eye that I purchased on Blender Market. Once I had figured out the eye color, I then played around with the iris and the pupil just to try and give it that little cute effect on it. Took way too long, but we got there eventually. Because I felt like the eyes weren't quite sitting in the eye sockets very well, I then extruded the socket out a little bit more so the eyes would be able to fit in there a little bit more, and that seemed to work out pretty well. And once I was happy with how Togepi looked, I attempted to put it on a photo background just to add that little bit more realism to it. Unfortunately, I don't know what I did. I tried shadow casting on a plane, but for the life of me it just would not work. So I gotta try and figure out how to do that within Blender. But again, I've managed to do something to make it do that. So instead I just ended up putting it in Photoshop, and make some adjustments through there. And here is where I attempt to create the shadow underneath Togepi and trying to match the direction of the sun as well. So this is actually my first attempt at doing something like this in Photoshop as well. Usually I just do basic stuff like thumbnails and all that sort of stuff. I was actually pleasantly surprised at how the shadow turned out, especially under the foot. And then eventually I make the shadow a little bit darker on the eggshell itself as well. And here it is, my version of Togepi. Let me know what your favorite Pokemon is, or what Pokemon I should do next, or what speed build I should do next. There's a lot of possibilities on what I could do, maybe, depending on my skill. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time in the next speed build video. Bye!